College football nerds here, back at it after our off-season hiatus. We are ready to talk football, and we've got a few show notes for you, a few season-long show notes of how we're going to change things up. We think it's for the better, so we hope you hang on, enjoy it. Let us know at the end of this video or any of these videos if you like kind of the approach we're taking. So what we're doing this season and maybe forever is Josh and I found that we like talking ball more than we like doing this segmented preview, top 10 sort of thing throughout the season. So we're going to structure our show in a way that we're going to have a long form show, hour, 2 hour, 3 hour discussion, Joe Rogan style, where we just talk football. And out of that, we'll break up some smaller videos. So if you're on YouTube and you don't want to hear the whole thing, you can wait and see kind of the stuff that we chop up out of our longer discussions, or you can listen to it on YouTube or the podcast as a whole long segment of just talking ball once a week. We'll have that for you. Want to make another note that we probably will be doing fewer live shows because some of that content and that approach is going to go into these longer discussions, and we're getting burned out. We got families and having to stay up till 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. It's a lot of fun, and we loved it. We want to take the best elements from that and bring them into our discussions for our more pre-recorded shows. We will do some live shows, but just not as many. Want to remind y'all or let y'all know that we've got a website up, kind of repurposed our site that we had years ago. It's new and improved, and it's really good. Right now, it's really just a place for us to write a little bit about college football and, more importantly, sign you up for our newsletter, collegefootballnerds.com, best newsletter on the internet for college football. Sign up. It's free, twice a week, 5-minute read. It's been really fun so far. There's some sample, or the ones we've sent out so far, you can see kind of how good, how fun it is. You're going to want to sign up for that. Getting into this, Josh, this discussion of some things that have happened since our hiatus. One is the EA NCAA game has hit some snags along the way from some player representation groups that are trying to make it a little tricky for them and kind of have their hand in the cookie jar and get paid themselves. One of the big ones was the TRO that Brandr group tried to get pushed through in the California court systems of all places, and it got thrown out recently. So EA won that. They've got some other player groups that are coming up along the way that are trying to slow things down so they can get their cut. But I want you as an attorney to kind of break down what a TRO is, what's going on, and we can get into a discussion about whether or not this game is actually going to happen. We think it is. But Josh, why don't you get us kicked off with that?
So the first thing you have to understand is that a TRO, a temporary restraining order, is sort of a procedure you can file in the middle of a court case to try to get the court to stop someone from taking an action. And generally what you use a TRO for is to say that, hey, we think somebody's doing something illegal. They're not allowed to do what they're doing. We want you to go ahead and stop them from doing whatever there is to do, that they are doing that we think is bad, so that they don't just continue to accrue more harm to us or to a third party. Long story short, in this case, Brandr was really trying to argue that EA was interfering with their ability to represent individual players and to some extent schools in representation for name, image, and likeness rights. And the judge in California was skeptical of the argument and essentially said that, in his view, there really wasn't an impingement of their rights for EA to be going through a different entity to try to talk through the players. EA had previously been talking with Brandr and talking about maybe using Brandr to collect licensing rights. And so this doesn't necessarily mean all this stuff goes away, but it means as of right now, the court doesn't think they're likely to prevail. So you don't get the TRO. And if you win, you can still get an injunction, but the court isn't going to cause any action to happen on EA's part until any court case is decided, which often can take quite a while. The thing that I want to point out about all this is that it really gets into the underbelly of the world we've created in name, image, and likeness rights. And several years ago, we put out a detailed video way before NIL was really on anybody's radar as coming out on what the realities were going to be of NIL and how it wasn't going to be just signing autographs. Still baffled how much pushback we got from people that were supposed player advocates on saying that, but that's a whole other discussion. Two, we talked about how the lack of a players association was going to make things really difficult. The NFL Players Association is a union, but it's a union primarily existing to negotiate salary contracts and try to set bounds on the way that you do things like endorsements. Without such an entity in college football, the problem you have is all the players individually have to sign up with agencies, which means there are multiple agencies in place. EA is talking with different ones, and this is essentially one agency fighting actions taken by a different player agency. No one represents all the players. No one represents all the schools. And so you end up with a contractual mess. And when we were talking about what would need to happen for EA Sports to come back, and that was, 5 years ago, my point was I don't know that you can really get what people want to get absent some sort of collective bargaining agreement, because on EA side, they don't want to sign 10,000 contracts with different Division One athletes, right? 85 players per school at 130 schools, that's a big number. So they want to be able to sign with a handful of individual agencies, and those agencies manage the contracts for the players because that limits the amount of legal paperwork. People like me are expensive. And it also limits the amount of liability, simplifies the contract, simplifies what goes into everything. And they have now their system where you can opt in or opt out. And I think that's probably pretty simple. And you can understand why EA went the way they did, to say that, look, this is going to be the contract for everybody. If you don't want to do it, you're free to opt out of it and not collect the money, or you can opt in and collect it, because they don't want to be negotiating individually. That's a morass, and it's going to get too expensive too fast.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I noted, because the second this TRO got thrown out, to your point, some other player representation group popped up and said, "Oh, but we're mad too, and this is an outrage, and we're going to block it because Brandr couldn't, but we're going to do it." And to my point, Josh, and I think that this is possibly where we're headed, and I'm curious what you think. I feel like there's going to be some social pressure from the players themselves that, I don't know if the pressure they're going to put is going to be on the representation groups or the other players, because I feel like there's far more players who would be in this game for free. And I'm not saying they should be. I think they should get paid, just clarify that. I'm not saying they shouldn't be paid, but I think there are more players that would rather be in this game for free to see themselves in the game than there are players who are mad that $500 isn't enough and are willing to hold up the progress of the game. There's a lot of people, when we tweet about this, they're like, just give me the game, and I'll play with mascots if I have to. And they make a good point that after 4 years, you're playing with computer-generated players anyway. It's a lot about the brand, the schools, the stadiums, the college atmosphere in the game, the ability to recruit and things like that. What do you think about this notion that, like, at some point, I feel like the people digging in their heels not only are going to upset the fans, but also upset a lot of players that want to see this game happen, want to see themselves in this game. They might put pressure on these other people because it's like you're holding up for more money, but, and maybe you want to get into the math a little bit on this, but like maybe 500 isn't the number, but 5,000 also isn't the number.
Yeah, I tweeted about this because I was trying to just break down the general numbers, and the thing I noted was that NCAA 14 sold 1 million copies. If you want to say it was $50 a copy, which is probably a very high number actually, because most of the copies sell on sale. International copies that don't always go for the same price. There's a lot of underlying economic stuff that goes into play here. They made about $50 million. And again, when I say other things, keep in mind, PlayStation Store, Microsoft Store probably gets a double-digit percentage cut of these sales, so they're not even really getting 50 million. There are 11,000 players, and if you're giving them all $500 each, that's $5.5 million. So if you were to say 5.5 million out of 50 million, that's over 10% of the gross proceeds of the game. And in truth, I think that number, people are going to say, well, games are now skewing $60, $70 on average. I don't think that's entirely true, but even if you assume that, well, when you start playing into the fact that, again, you have those publisher cuts from the various storefronts where the game's sold, you're still probably looking at 10% or more of the gross proceeds. And that's a lot. AAA game development's really expensive these days. You still have to pay the schools. You still have to pay the bowls. You still have to pay a lot of other stuff to make that game happen. And if you're taking a 10+% haircut, your profit margins, which aren't crazy to start with, start going away. NCAA football, I think, will sell a lot of copies the first year it comes back. It probably a good bit fewer the next year, and then probably a return to normal in year 3. EA has to know that's the case. And, again, when you talk 10% of the proceeds at $500, well, you multiply it by 10, and that's 100% of the proceeds, right? They can't pay $5,000 per player. That's probably about as much money as they will make on the game. So the number's got to sit around there at $500. Maybe it's $1,000 or something. Maybe they negotiate individually with a couple couple players that they want to put on the cover or do some sort of special story with in the game or something like that. But I think they're going to limit it to just a handful of players that they want for a special purpose. And one of the big stories that came out was a former Penn State player that was complaining about it and saying this isn't worth it and players need to opt out and they're worth a lot more than that. And I don't know, I was just kind of taken aback because the economics of it are pretty clear that for the average player, and the average player being a second or third string offensive lineman on a football team, they're probably not really worth $500. Like you're saying, how many people know the second string lineman for the University of Oklahoma? Maybe if you're an OU fan, you might know all the second string players. I doubt anybody at any other school does. So the value of those players' names is pretty limited, and that's just the reality of it. As you said, it could be computer generated names by year 3 or 4 when you're playing your dynasty and nobody cares. So, with all due respect, I think a lot of these discussions that come up and a lot of these news stories you have to take with a grain of salt because, again, former Penn State player, what does he do now? I mean, he's a player advocate, which essentially means he's an agent. He's going to generate money based off how much money the players make. And all these people that are advocating for players, at some extent, they have skin in the game and they want the players to make as much money as possible, regardless of whether or not it creates a sustainable market, whether it really encourages the games to continue to be generated, whether it's good for the players that don't make money, right? Because a lot of times these guys represent the starting quarterbacks, the starting running backs, the starting wide receivers. They don't represent the third string right guard who has no value.
Right.
They don't care whether that guy gets $500. He's not one of their clients. So you really, I hate to say it, but you got to take things with a massive grain of salt. You have to be extremely skeptical of anything you hear from a player advocate, knowing that player advocate really equals agent. And one of the things I find really disappointing is a lot of media outlets quote these people constantly. And in fairness, there really is no other voice. There's no anti-player advocate, so it's either the agents or nobody. But I think it really slants a lot of the media discussions on these issues because the only people you're hearing quoted are people that are, really in it solely for making the biggest players with the biggest names the most money so they get the largest cut of the profits. And they want it all to be done through a licensing angle, and they want it all done licensing through them to tie back to the TRO issue with EA Sports and Brandr.
Yeah, and the thing is, when you push narrative and policy in an echo chamber, then you are blind to unintended consequences. And in this case, it could be that EA says, screw it, we're not dealing with this issue. We're just not going to make the game because it doesn't make sense. And then literally everyone loses. EA loses, the players lose, and the fans lose. And I would argue the players are the ones that lose the least because they're not going to get $5,000. To a player in college football right now, given the state of NIL, the difference between getting $500 and $1,000 is not that big a deal, especially not to those at the top who are already doing monster deals, and they're probably not caring that much whether they get anything out of the game. They'd rather see themselves in the game. All right, shifting gears a little bit, Josh, another topic that came up while you were gallivanting around Europe was the ESPN layoffs. And we got some major traction on a tweet and on an article we wrote, which is another plug for the newsletter because you see the kind of content that we write, and this is one of the things that we talked about. Josh, the layoffs are, especially for college football fans, juxtaposed against this massive $80 million contract that Pat MacAfee got. And it seems like if you speak out about it or have concern about it, because there's beloved people that got let go. David Pollack is one of them that got caught up in this mix. And there's pushback like that any criticism of these moves is a criticism against Pat McAfee. But my contention is it's just an indicator, a further indicator, that ESPN doesn't really understand the college sports fan, the college sports market in a way that they should, given their scope and their scale. And I'm curious what you think about this, but to me, it's not that they have Pat McAfee involved in the college space. It's that they're trying to force him into game day, which I would argue is a Hail Mary to not lose Gen Z, and millennials, like a lot of younger generation, and try to keep the ratings there. Instead, they're kind of pissing everybody off because Pat McAfee fans see him as selling out to Disney, and the older fans who don't really like his shtick see it as a big turnoff that he's there at all, kind of invading their space. Am I right in that? Like they're kind of messing it up, or do you think this is something they had to do regardless, given the tides of, social media and where things are going?
Yeah, I saw some of the Twitter replies when you were off trying to start wars in foreign lands while I was in Europe. Um, I don't know. I think a lot of times these issues are a lot less coupled than people want to make them out to be, right? You can have Pat McAfee and have it to be a good deal and still have it be bad to let go of Pollack. I do think the issues are tied together because at some level ESPN has a certain pot of money and they spend a lot of that money on McAfee. And I have nothing wrong with McAfee. I actually like him. I think he's pretty entertaining. I think he brings a different angle to the product. Now I like a lot of people in the space and I like a lot of different angles. I know there's people that don't like RG3 that much for some reason. I actually think he has some of the best energy in the sport, and I actually think he's one of the better up and coming commentators. I think he's got to learn to tighten things up, but that's not surprising for a guy that's new to the space. I think there's a lot of people that have been stale in commentating, whether it be during games or outside of games in ESPN. I think they're realizing that to a certain degree and cutting people loose. But I also think underlying all this, my real opinion is that they don't really have a good grasp of the content they want to make. Giving that kind of money to McAfee, to me, signaled that they feel like they need to have a product. They don't really know what that product is supposed to be. And so they're just trying to buy ready-made product. And they feel like McAfee sells and that he's popular and he's entertaining. And if you get the Pat McAfee show, then you get all that stuff that you want to have. And I know there are a lot of other things behind the scenes. McAfee's trying to take care of his people. So I don't feel like that money is just all to him personally. It's not quite such a greedy pull. There's a lot of people behind the scenes that make those shows work. And good people that operate at a high level have a lot of help. We don't have help. That's why our show is so terrible. But I think the reality for ESPN is that they've lost sight of the value of just quality content that's tailor-made for college sports. There's certainly a lot of people that enjoy Twitter media and enjoy hot takes, and they're going to watch ESPN for the flowing ticker. But one of the points you made that I thought was really apt in all those Twitter discussions is I don't need to watch ESPN Sports Center now to find out what the latest player news is for people in the SEC or the Big Ten. I have Twitter. I have the internet. I know when guys get entering the transfer portal or they get suspended or they get injured. And so the need for just rolling news services went away, and I don't know that they know how to fill it. My opinion is I think a lot of people in college football are big fans of a niche product. They're intense fans of their team. They know the details of their team at a high level. It's always a challenge for us to talk about football teams because if we don't come really well prepared, you guys tend to blast us. And yeah, we do make mistakes sometimes. We usually get called out on it. But it takes a lot of work to make as few mistakes as we do make. And I don't know that ESPN caters to that. I don't know that they have a lot of content these days that are drill down, film analysis. They don't spend, and when they do it, they kind of put it on a slow time slot. They don't invest a lot of resources in it. I think it doesn't get traction because they don't promote it and they don't make it the high level product it should be. A lot of their commentary now is very high level, which again, at that point you're just competing with all the free internet articles out there with hot takes. If I want to read that, I can just sit and scroll Twitter and hear a lot of junk opinions. I want to hear opinions from experts. I want to hear opinions from experts that know the team really well, that have insights to the team and what's going on behind the scenes. They have really, I think, kicked all that out to some of it is sports team sites and fan sites, which I think are operating at a very high level, and they have all the details about what's happening in practice. They have all the details in recruiting, and they're way above mainstream media at this point in terms of, I think, as an information source. And then people that do deep dives on game previews. And let me be clear, we're going to still do game previews, okay? We're just not going to be quite as regimented in only doing 3 game previews a week. We may, try to do a few more, do them shorter. We're going to do them in a context of a broader conversation. But we're going to cut them up and still do game previews. It's weird to me that ESPN doesn't have an equivalent to the content we do or the content that Josh Pate does. And I think this is a little bit of a cry from help from them, but they're just buying one product to try to replicate and fix all those things that they don't have or that don't work well. I don't know. In my mind, it's it's a quick, easy fix that they throw a load of money at that probably doesn't really solve a lot of their problems.
See, I would argue that they just don't understand college sports fans and interest, and that's kind of wrapped up in what you just said. I used to watch PTI religiously until I realized that every college football take from Mike Wilbon was so uneducated and almost contemptuous. Like anything college sports related had a negative feeling to it. And then Chris Russo is now involved with ESPN, and he's given takes on college sports. That guy's show, if you listen to Mad Dog's show before he went, to ESPN or whatever, he barely talked about college sports. And the thing is, college markets aren't profitable in terms of large scale. NFL markets, NBA markets are profitable, and that's where ESPN has always gone. And that has always made money. But the problem is when you try to shoehorn pro sports people into a college space, the passion lacking is obvious. The people that are there for a paycheck is obvious. And I think that they're trying to get that with McAfee, but he has always given me a feel of a pro sports guy. I hope that they lean into his platform on YouTube and the social side, which I think that that's where it should have been, like all of it. I don't know that he's a good fit for game day. Like you, I like him, but I also see that he might be problematic. Josh, I had one more point on this. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me turn this conversation, because you actually brought up an interesting point to me. When we talk about expansion and we talk about the reframing of college football, is there an argument that a lot of what's happening right now in terms of consolidation of teams into a handful of conferences, the likelihood that the major conferences, I think, probably will break away from the rest of college football within the next 10 years, do you think a lot of that's being driven by TV not knowing how to handle college sports, but they have these huge dollar contracts? So rather than figuring out college sports, they think, hey, let's just make it more like the NFL, where I only have to follow 32 teams. I can be knowledgeable because there's not as much out there to follow. And then just assuming if you make college like the NFL, then they can cover it well and they can make more money off of it. I mean, is that... I've never really thought about it that plainly put, but do you think is that what's going on?
I think it's that is part of it, because I think the NFLification of college football has been slowly happening over the last 10 years. And if you go to any game at a major P5, especially SEC Big Ten, you'll notice that parking is a lot more expensive and the cheap parking is a lot further off campus. Tailgating has been completely taken over by the universities themselves. And there is no kind of like organic gathering of a family. Like you go to a tailgating section, now it's all corporate. It's all pre-set up stuff, very expensive. You go to stadiums and it's ribbon boards and screens, and everything that was once character has kind of been sucked out of it, because you can put an ad on a ribbon board. You can put an advertisement on a video board. You can make money off of tailgating, and these schools didn't realize it until they did. The problem is TV, though, because at the same time, the TV product has gotten so much better that, and so widespread, to your point about these contracts, that there's a downside to even going to the game because you miss a lot of the TV product. And I do think consolidation is happening there, but I think that there's a handful of people on the media side, and there's a handful of people on the NCAA/AD side that see a short-term money grab, and they are really ignorant to the potential long-term health of the sport eroding because of what they're doing right now. And this is a point that you make all the time. And I know we want to move on to other topics, but this is super interesting to me because of like this one ESPN deal sort of touches so many issues in college football. But one of the points that you've made a lot on Twitter that people disagree with, that I think is completely true, is that the more you consolidate power and the more you give opportunities to big name teams, give them mulligans, get them in playoffs, and they keep winning and this momentum keeps going, the more you consolidate this power, the less people care about Georgia Tech football or Washington State football. and you have this hyper interest from a smaller group of fans. And the point you always make is, because people say, well, if Georgia Tech football goes away, those people will just become football fans. But your point is, or they'll become Georgia fans. But your point is, no, they'll just cease being football fans.
Yeah, that's always been my great fear long term for the sport, and I'm not sure if it's going to pan out or not. Is there's this belief that major college football, the more you accentuate it, the more you make more big games happen on a weekly basis, the more the ratings are going to go up. But I think there's this underlying point of how much do people watch the big game every week because it is the big game that week, right? That they're Missouri fans, they're Georgia Tech fans, they're Kentucky fans, and Alabama's playing Tennessee, and they all know those two teams, and they play one or the other, and they're interested to see what the result is because it's in their conference and it affects their conference and their conference standings, so they all tune in. Well, if Missouri gets frozen out of college football, if Georgia Tech gets frozen out of college football, are Missouri fans going to still care to watch a Tennessee game? Are Georgia Tech fans going to still care to watch a Georgia game? I don't buy that they are. I think you're going to lose a lot of those fans. And sure, there are people like us that are big national fans of the sport. But for a lot of people, and I think there's absolutely zero wrong with this, they are fans of the sport relative to their team. And when you take their team out of the equation and you alienate what may well be the majority of fans in college football, if you cut things down to like 32 teams, I think the rest of those fans may just give up and move to other sports. I don't buy that you're going to have the same net eyeballs that you have today. I think a lot of the viewership you do get of big games today is really the benefit of everybody else that's been watching football all day for their own personal teams. And they say, I'm going to watch my team and I'm going to watch, I'm going to watch Georgia, Florida. I'm going to watch my team and I'm going to watch Ohio State, Michigan at the end of the day. And so they watch football. They're in that mode. They go to the other game, right?
Why do fans in Pullman, Washington care if USC and UCLA are playing now that they're in the Big Ten? That, to me, they don't, right? Like, they just don't care.
And there will be, look, in this move we're making, I think the individual schools, at least in the near term, will see an uptick because I think, like USC and UCLA, the truth is I don't think there are a ton of Pac-12 fans watching games all around the conference these days. It's just the hard reality of it, part of which is due to TV deals, part of which is due to the degradation of various teams in the conference. And there are going to be a lot of Big Ten fans that tune into USC and UCLA games, and those two teams will see an uptick because of the move they made. But I could actually ironically see, an Indiana-Ohio State game, how much cumulative rating do they get from people in Pullman, Washington watching that game because it's a close game, or people in Texas that are TCU fans watching the game? I don't know. And I think there are a lot of assumptions made about where fans are going to come from that, let's be honest, no one knows how this works. And you can argue with us the same way people argue with us when we said the NIL changes were going to turn into the Wild Wild West. And we got a lot of pushback and a lot of people told us it wasn't going to be the case. We were 100% right. And our point was always then, as I'm saying it now, no one, doesn't matter if you're the president of one of these TV companies, they don't have any better idea or theory than we do about how fans are going to react to these changes. And a lot of them are making assumptions based off how much is going to make them money in 2 or 3 years because they've got their 3-year contract as the CEO of this broadcast company and they need to make money now for their shareholders. They're not really concerned. They don't about what happens 10 to 15 years from now. They are not college football fans. They don't probably particularly understand college football. They don't necessarily know what the long-term implications are going to be, how people react. And so I would make zero assumptions that any moves being made, same thing's true, by the way, of presidents and a lot of even ADs, that these moves are really thoughtful and well-designed for the well-being of the sport, even 5 years from now. I mean, I think you should be as skeptical as you want to be on whether it's actually even going to work.
All right, shifting gears to an actual preview, to your point that we are going to do previews. We're going to do some team previews throughout the course of July and August. And the first one, obviously, the reigning national championship team, Georgia Bulldogs. We thought we'd cover them first, give them their due. And Josh, since people have been digging in the schedule, there's been a lot of heat to Georgia, and I think part of it is people who love the sport want to see the best team play the best teams. I would argue that Georgia fans want to see their team play the best teams, and it brings me to my first point of discussion. That is the schedule, and that two things can be true at the same time. One, Georgia fans, your schedule is easy this year. It's just the truth. Two, it's not your fault. It's not Georgia's fault. And this is a drum I've beaten for a decade. Georgia, Clemson, until this year Ohio State, Alabama, Texas, Oklahoma, USC, and Notre Dame are teams that go out of their way to schedule good teams outside of their conference. I know Notre Dame doesn't play in a conference, but they schedule harder than they have to. Georgia already has a Power 5 team on their schedule in Georgia Tech. They could say, look, we got our 8+1, we're done with it. They schedule a second, intentionally making it harder for themselves to get their team involved in big games. Home and homes with Notre Dame, playing Clemson multiple times during this stretch where Clemson was in the playoffs every single year. Like opened with Oregon last year. And so people want to look at this situation and make it analogous to the Michigan situation, which is not. And Michigan fans, this is the last year. Y'all get back on track next year without a conference games, so you won't hear it from me next year. Michigan canceled their series with UCLA to make sure that they had consecutive years with 8 home games. Georgia did not cancel their series with Oklahoma. The conference realignment forced Georgia to cancel. Alabama's game series with Texas is going to be finished before Texas and Oklahoma join the SEC. So this is, and to my point, that's always been, the thing I've always said is scheduling is about intent. You can't control if a team, when they finally land on your schedule, is good or not. You can control what you were trying to do when you scheduled them. Georgia was trying to put another brand name on their schedule in Oklahoma. They weren't able to. But Josh, that doesn't mean their schedule isn't easy. So I want Georgia fans to understand that it's okay for us to point out that you have an easy schedule, because that brings up other talking points about strategy and player development that we, live in reality. But that doesn't mean we're crushing you or your team, because we have a lot of respect for what Georgia does out of conference.
I think that's a pretty good summary of the situation, right? That Georgia's schedule is pretty easy in 2023. Period. It's not due to anything really within Georgia's control. Georgia cannot control the fact that Florida is down. They can't control the fact that Oklahoma ended up having to cancel because of the nature of conference realignment, and that series was going to be split over the divide when the conference got realigned. They can't control the fact that Georgia Tech sucks. I mean, they schedule in a P5 every year, and we just don't count it because they're not very good. Which, by the way, quick aside, everybody that complains about the SEC not playing 9 conference games also gives Georgia 0 credit for playing Georgia Tech, which is a P5 team and would be a conference game in the ACC. I just always have to point out, right, that everybody cares about conference games. If you're in a conference with with a 9-game conference schedule, as if every one of those is hard when they, 2 of them are Rutgers and Maryland or what have you. But if another team in another conference plays one of the weaker teams out of conference, then that doesn't count as if it's a real game. Like, it's such a screwed up, self-serving double standard. But the one thing that really matters for Georgia for our discussions this year, it's really going to be trying to nitpick them to understand how good they are. And it's the same, understand it is the same exact sort of standard and situation we've applied to Clemson in recent years. Clemson would often play 1 to 2 real games of magnitude, and we would talk about how we're going to be really critical of little nitpicky things because we're trying to evaluate how they're going to play at the end of the year. And one of the other refrains we've often said is, just because you play a bad schedule does not mean you're a bad team. What we usually want to see is top teams will dominate an easy schedule start to finish. And we want to see that level of domination first off. So we're going to be critical of anywhere where you're not dominant, because it's a bad sign come playoff time. And maybe the best example of that is way back when in 2014 with Florida State, that couldn't dominate what was an easy schedule. They were the reigning national title team from the year prior. They got to the playoffs and they just looked awful. And it's what everybody knew all along. They weren't a particularly good team. They just didn't come back the same way they were before. They lost pieces that they didn't quite replicate. Georgia needs to not be them over the course of the year. We're going to hold you to a very high standard relative to the teams you're playing, because we know the teams you're playing aren't necessarily quite as good as what teams are going to face in the SEC West or the Big Ten East. It just is what it is. But it also doesn't mean that Georgia isn't a team that can't dominate every week. Doesn't mean they can't dominate in the playoffs. And one thing I want to note there too, you've had a lot of people talk about strength of schedule, talk about Georgia's strength of schedule last year, and they tend to a lot of times focus on kind of getting confused between end of year strength of schedules and midseason strength of schedules. What really matters is your strength of schedule come December, either before or immediately after the conference championship game. In FPI, the fourth hardest strength of schedule in the country was TCU last year. Nobody thinks TCU's regular season strength of schedule was that particularly hard compared to a lot of SEC and Big Ten teams. But they had to play Michigan, they had to play Georgia in the playoff. And when you play those two teams, when you had to play Georgia, anybody that played Georgia, their strength of schedule got really, really hard. LSU ended number 2 because of that. Georgia, who, by the way, doesn't have the ability to play Georgia, Georgia's strength of schedule to end of the year only ended up 8th. And so, to win a national title, Georgia's going to have to win the SEC championship game, a playoff game, and another playoff game more than likely. That 3-game stretch is going to be harder than what anybody else has to face in the regular season, what anyone has to face in the regular season. So everything we talk about during the regular season is going to be really geared towards 2 points. One, is your season going to be good enough to qualify for the playoff? And then 2, if so, how is your current team going to translate when you face an Alabama or an Ohio State or a USC, which is a completely different standard of football? Michigan fans have found that out the hard way when they played Georgia a couple years ago. So I think that's where everything needs to come from. And the first point, I think, is maybe one of the more major ones when you talk about the schedule. And I'll let you talk about this, Daniel, that one of the problems for Georgia, I think, is because of the lack of high-end teams. And we may talk later in our long discussion about Tennessee and where they're going to be. The ability for Georgia to have mistakes and blemishes and make the playoff is probably going to be somewhat limited.
But yeah, I think that it's a double-edged sword, right? Because you have very slim margin for error. Like 2021 Georgia losing to Alabama and still making the playoffs. Yes, it depends on what everybody else does around you, which is something you'll always hear us. That's a drum beat you'll always hear from us, is like, you can't, and this is why we say you can't compare year to year, where people are like, oh, so-and-so got in this year and we didn't get in this other year. Those are things that don't matter, because what you do in that year relative to what everybody else does is what matters. So I think that the good thing for Georgia is they'll have time to work out kinks and wrinkles against teams that are of lesser, quality that might have otherwise resulted in a loss in week 3. When you've got a new quarterback, new OC, and you're working out, new players on the defense, those things contribute to you taking an L early in the season that might keep you out of the playoffs, because you don't have the luxury of working out these issues against a team that's not good enough to take advantage of it. But the flip side of that is, yes, I think that like Clemson in the past, who, by the way, to your point, you can be a great team with a bad schedule, they were good enough to get in deservingly anyway with that bad schedule. But you do need to be consistently dominant because you have such a slim margin for error. Josh, talk about the scenario. Texas plays Alabama. Georgia plays Alabama. If Georgia loses to Alabama in the SEC championship game and Texas loses to Alabama in the regular season, you've got a situation where one might be a Big 12 champion and one might not be a conference champion. So the same scenario happening, but because of margin for error with the regular season, it might leave Georgia out.
Yeah, and that's something I hinted at earlier when I talked about the 3 games at the end of the year. I think Georgia's path this year is going to be very difficult, because I think even if they're a 12-0 team in the regular season, if they lose that SEC title game to whoever it is, LSU, Alabama, Texas A&M, they're really going to be in trouble at 12-1 if there's another 12-1 team that did win their conference championship game. And to your point with Texas, it's an interesting hypothetical, right? If Texas loses to Alabama and Georgia loses to Alabama, and they both run the table otherwise, Texas, being the conference champion, is probably going to get the edge over Georgia, even though Georgia's in the SEC, because, again, Georgia's SEC schedule isn't that hard. And the view is going to be that Georgia played one really hard team from the SEC West. They lost that game. Texas lost 2, but hey, they're a conference champion. and I think Texas jets in over Georgia. So Georgia, one of the big dangers to me, I think, is like you said, they really can't afford that 2021 scenario where they lose the conference championship game and get in. Absent the fact that, again, 2017 is always my big example. Why did Alabama get in 2017? It's because the field was junk. Most years, 2017 Alabama does not make the playoff. Shouldn't make the playoff. Probably didn't deserve to make it in 2017. But you got to put 4 teams in, and sometimes there aren't 4 deserving teams. 2017 was that case. And then so you've got the scheduling issue, and then you got the whole other issue of trying to extrapolate results and us trying to nitpick teams. To your point, I think Georgia has the advantage that there were a lot of weeks where they could have an off week and probably win the game anyway. 2018 Clemson was not a particularly good team early in the year. They played Texas A&M, won the game solidly, but didn't look overly impressive. And later on, they found Trevor Lawrence, and they had several weeks to get him up to speed before they got in the playoffs. They just weren't a great team in the first half of the year, and I don't know that they would have made it without losses had they had to play better teams. And so how do you differentiate between that team in 2018 and then somebody like 2017 Clemson, who really wasn't ever showing to be that great of a team all throughout the year? We got to the playoffs, and frankly, they just weren't that good. And I think that 2017 Clemson team flies under the radar in a lot of these discussions, that Clemson wasn't always that great. 2020 Clemson maybe was in the same boat, frankly. So, yeah, there's a lot of complications to Georgia. We probably will want to get to X's and O's and players a little bit, but, sort of frame the whole discussion, because at the end of the day, Georgia's probably going to be a lot better than the competition. They're probably going to win minimum of 11 games this year, I think, in the between the just in the regular season. And a lot of what we're talking about with Georgia is going to be geared solely towards the playoff and not even really discussing how much they're going to be challenged in the regular season, just given their overall talent level.
It will be interesting to see the opportunity for player development. And I think that we're feeling a little bit of this with Georgia, at least in the national media, or maybe I'm just too much on Twitter and in the fan sphere, but Georgia is getting the same treatment that Alabama gets now and has gotten for the last decade plus, in that when Georgia has either personnel exit, either coaches or players exit that were critical to their success, people feel like, okay, now is when they have to rebuild, or now is when they're going to really feel those exits. But Josh, Georgia is at a point right now in terms of recruiting and development and overall personnel and just their system that they are reloading. So even when you've got a quarterback that, led you to 2 national championships leave, or an offensive coordinator leave, like, they've got so much on cruise control in a good way that even if they had a tough schedule this year, I'm not inclined to think that they lose more than one game, just because I think that they are in that same, stratosphere as Alabama has been, in terms of, like, you tell us every year we're going to need to rebuild, but we're actually reloading, and then that's when we win a national championship. I think that's what we're going to see. That's what Georgia's saying the same thing, is we're going to win a national championship anyway, because those guys are just as hungry, and it's now just their turn, and we're just that stacked as a system and in our personnel.
Yeah, and the interesting thing there with Georgia is they were so much better than everyone else last year, and for most of the season, maybe outside an Alabama team that was peaking at one point, really all through 2021, Georgia can take a step or two back and still win the national title. And I know that was our refrain last year, right? That Georgia, our point was, we don't think Georgia's going to be as good as they were in 2021. And I'm actually not sure that they were, but that it really may not matter, because they were so much better than everyone else, and we expected most everyone else to take a step back, that you could still win all your games. I think that was probably somewhat true. I don't know. There was no 2020 Alabama last year. There was no, even Ohio State, they were really good, but they still really weren't a complete, consistent team on both sides of the football. And they pushed Georgia really hard in that game. And maybe a better Ohio State team is able to beat Georgia, right? It wouldn't have taken a whole lot, but they had too many kinks in that football team. They still weren't really a complete team. They weren't really complete on both sides of the line of scrimmage in the way they needed to be to handle Georgia. So, yeah, I mean, Georgia's in a perfect position to rebuild. And to talk a little bit about personnel, I mean, there are a lot of key pieces that are returning. There are a lot of pieces that were a rotational part of the team that I think are going to be more important this year. They were an efficiency machine par excellence last year. We talked a lot about their ability to sustain drives, was something we almost have never seen before. I want to say they were third in the country in points per drive. One of the most underrated stats, in my opinion, in college football was the ability the last 2 years for Georgia to score a lot of points relative to the amount of possessions they had. The scores weren't really high because they didn't try to score quickly, and because their defense kind of ground other teams down. And given how much they ran the ball, the games were just kind of shorter. But in terms of points per possession, they were actually just as good or better than a lot of other teams. Like they were right up there with Alabama last year when Alabama was playing good football. And that kind of before Alabama fell off a cliff, we were even noting, Georgia's really not behind any of these teams. They're not really behind Ohio State on the offensive side of the ball. And that was really built around guys like Rosemy-Jacksain and McConkey and Arian Smith, Brock Bowers, Washington. All that depth really combined to form a team that had a lot of really good options. The running back core is really deep. And I would say really across the board with Georgia offensively, my opinion for a little while now has been, I don't know that there's a Todd Gurley or a Nick Chubb on this football team, somebody that's a surefire carry the team at an NFL level guy, but there are a lot of guys that are quality starters at an NFL level. And when you have that many options in college, it really changes the way teams have to defend you, because most teams, as we say a lot, they don't really have a high-level third or especially fourth corner on the team. They don't really have enough linebackers to be able to cover multiple tight ends at a high level. They usually have one or two guys that are really good, and they may have a good unit, but at some level, teams usually have a pretty bad drop-off in their depth at every position. And if you've got that many high-quality guys, Georgia can line up in whatever kind of set they want to do and expose you. The Oregon game in particular to start the year, I thought was a great example of that, because I don't think Oregon's secondary was very deep. And Georgia just went, we're going to spread you wide. We're going to dump the ball off to a high-level player, and we're going to watch him hurdle or run over you for 15 yards every play, because we don't think your guys can line up man-on-man. We'll find the good matchup, and we'll just destroy you. They did the same thing to TCU, I think, in the championship game. So that's there. But I think the questions start to arise on how much of a step back you're going to take from an efficiency perspective, and how much of a step back you may or may not take from the defensive side of the ball. And if you do take that step back, how much of a step back are you going to have to take before you get to the point where people actually can beat you? Where you're off day like you had against Missouri, does that become a loss instead of a close win? And those are the games where I think you start to nitpick Georgia, because they are an excellent team, and I want to reinforce an excellent team with clearly one of the top three teams in the country in terms of talent. Them, Ohio State, and Alabama are on a different level than everybody else. But we're really just evaluating them on, are you going to lose a game? And these little nitpicky questions, I think, start to determine that answer.
Yeah, I mean, Georgia fans, I guess they've been here a couple of years, but welcome to where Alabama and Clemson fans have felt a little bit alienated from us recently, in that when you get so good, the good is baked in, and we really try to find where you could possibly be beaten, and it comes off a little negative where it's not. I'm glad you worked Oregon in there too, because when we're talking about the schedule situation for Georgia opened the season with a team that won 10 games last year, 10 or 11 games last year in Oregon, I think, beat them so badly that Georgia literally got no credit for that win. I remember arguing with people all year last year who were like, Georgia hasn't played anybody. Georgia, because they beat them so bad, the game was completely discredited. Like, the win was completely omitted from people's minds. Like, if Georgia wins that game 27-23, they're like, oh man, Georgia, got a good win against a good team. But because Georgia was so much better than everybody else, and nobody's beaten Oregon that bad, Georgia got no credit for it, when in reality, it was a confirmed result. It was a result that informed on how good Georgia was, in spite of how good Oregon also was. So I thought that was really funny last year. So it's like Georgia could beat Oklahoma this year 43-2, and Oklahoma win 9-10 games, and Georgia wouldn't get credit for it anyway. So one of the things that I do want to talk about in terms of what I thought was a key to Georgia's efficiency monster status for the last couple of years was how good of a fit Monken and Bennett were, and how great Monken was at either his system or just a wizard at tailoring what he could to his personnel. In your opinion, because everybody's focusing on Carson Beck and Bennett leaving and all that experience walking out the door and an unproven quarterback coming in this year, in your opinion, which is the bigger potential speed bump for Georgia? The new quarterback or the new OC?
Am I allowed to cheat and say you can't really decouple the two?
You can, I guess. You always do. So,
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you force me to give an answer, I'd probably say the quarterback, because at the end of the day, the quarterback's the one handling the ball, right? But I think there was such a strong marriage between what they were able to get from the OC and the quarterback position in unison last year that it just worked perfectly. We were on the Stetson Bennett bandwagon way
first,
ahead of everybody else.
before
Okay?
Georgia
Like,
fans.
I'm gonna do victory laps on that for a long time. In 2020, even, we were really out there saying, look, Bennett's playing good football. He got a shoulder hurt in that Florida game, and I think he doesn't have the physical tools to play with this sort of shoulder injury or something like that in any sort of high level. The guy's at his best when he's a quick release efficiency machine. And last year and the year prior, he was clearly a fifth and sixth year player that understood college football at a level nobody else did. I mean, the fun stat I have is that Stetson Bennett is older than Jalen Hurts. I mean, he's been playing football a long time, and he was the equivalent of like a third-year NFL guy that was still playing college, and you could tell. And when you combine that with Monken's scheme, which let them really just tailor the offense to his strengths, move the quarterback around a lot. They had a lot of high-efficiency throws, a lot of quick throws from 5 to 15 yards, with an ability to get really schematically, get guys open, get the ball out fast, get a completion, and they move the ball down the field like clockwork. And they had a lot of high-end statistics, high-end yard per attempt number. Maybe you can, I don't know if you can find that off the fly, but I don't have it in front of me. For a team that didn't bomb the ball down the field a ton. And usually when you see guys that are throwing for like 12 yards per attempt or 10 yards per attempt, they're Joe Burrow throwing to Chase for 60-yard bombs on a regular basis, or
I've got the number.
Alabama with Tagovailoa. So what do you have it in front of you? What was
Stetson Bennett
per
finished
attempt?
5th in the nation in yards per attempt, tied with Caleb Williams, and he was so Hendon Hooker and C.J. Stroud were the only two Power 5 quarterbacks that had a higher yard per attempt average than Stetson Bennett.
And the quarterbacks you're talking about there were throwing bombs all year, right? Hendon Hooker was constantly throwing deep shots. So, of course, his yard per attempt number is going to be kind of high. For Bennett to be at that level without taking those shots means that he's completing an obscene amount of his passes at 10 to 15 yards. And that's what made Georgia the machine they were. So I think now that you move out of that scheme, so one, you probably are going to lose a little bit in terms of constantly having an open guy and constantly having that read. But even without it, even if you still had him, I don't know that you get the same result because you don't have the quarterback in his sixth year of the system that always knew where to look and throw the football. And it's seamless, and people don't understand it, and you don't see it. But it is a special thing for a quarterback to drop back and know where he's supposed to be throwing every play. And it makes it look so much easier than it actually is. And I will say I watched the spring game with Carson Beck and Vandegrift. One, I felt like Beck clearly to me looks a couple steps ahead of Vandegrift right now. He's just developmentally further ahead. But what you see from Beck is a much more prototypical passer. He's taller. He's not as mobile as Bennett. Bennett was way underrated for his just overall quickness in the pocket. I don't know what his 40 time is compared to his shuttle, but the thing that made Bennett special was his short area quickness. He could burst out of the pocket around a D-end or a linebacker. It was really hard to take down. And he had an ability because of that to constantly take plays that should be negative plays and turn them into positive plays. Constantly finding a way to get 6 yards or 7 yards when it should be a sack or a throwaway.
Which makes it hard to get them off the field, which is the key to the efficiency monster.
Right. And the thing with Beck is I think you're going to see more of a vertical passing game. He can step his foot down and drive better than Bennett for sure, can put more velocity on the ball. And when he's on time and rhythm throwing to his primary reads, he looks really good. I think the issues that we're going to have to nitpick on are what happens when the pocket breaks down a little bit. What happens when he can't throw on rhythm and on time? Same issues that we nitpicked on C.J. Stroud, because I think in a lot of ways, Beck and maybe Vandegrift too are more similar players to Stroud than they were Bennett. And the problem for guys like that usually start to crop up only when they're in adverse circumstances. So he's probably going to. Beck may light people up that are inferior teams in a way that Bennett didn't. And he may struggle against better teams in a way that Bennett never did in his last 2 years. And it's going to come down to his understanding of the offense. But I think especially it's going to come down to the time it takes for him to release the ball, his ability to escape the pocket, his ability to make good decisions in the face of pressure. I know Bennett wasn't perfect, but he was a lot better than he ever got credit for. And those are all things that, right now are just hypotheticals. So I'm saying those are the things I'm going to be looking for over the course of the year, things I'm going to be nitpicking, because those things are going to really determine how Georgia from that 12-game schedule turns into a playoff team. And they've got a lot of time to fine-tune Beck or Vandegrift, whoever the starter is, and work out those kinks. But we need to see them worked out over the course of the year, because the way they work as passers, the way the offense I think is going to function is a more pro-style offense, which is going to be more dependent upon being able to run the ball to open up the pass. That stuff is much more affected when you play high-level defenses and you end up in a shootout. That's when you have more of a tendency to start to stall, more of a tendency to create negative plays. So I think the ability for Georgia to consistently score tons of points and move the football consistently against no matter who they play, probably going to fall off a little bit. I think the ceiling is going to be higher against worse competition. I think the floor may be a little bit lower. And then trying to figure out where they land in those two things is going to be really the challenge on the offensive side of the ball.
And I have looked, and I know you looked too. I couldn't see any definitive statements on Rara Thomas and his availability, but I think that there's huge upside to having a quarterback coming in fresh, and you've got a lot of experience with Ladd McConkey. You've got Brock Bowers coming back, which, just as a quick aside, I know we got to wrap Georgia up, but Josh, is it wild to you that he's still playing college football? Because I tweeted a question that did a pretty good amount of numbers on give me a player who, going back from all of college football eternity, back to the beginning, give me a player who you thought day one, game one, true freshman, was the most NFL ready. And Brock Bowers was the number one response we got. Is it kind of weird that he's still going to be walking around a college campus?
It does feel odd, and it's because Brock Bowers as a junior has played more football than a lot of people have, once they finish their career, right? I mean, he's played tons of snaps and been the focus since day one as a freshman, and it's a rare thing. There aren't that many guys that get focused on like that. You look around the conference, there have been players that played at a high level and they were that dominant. You look at guys like Kyle Pitts at Florida, really dominant, wasn't playing that much as a true freshman. I think maybe the exceptions, there have been a couple Alabama receivers as freshmen that came on strong, but even those guys didn't really play a ton until maybe halfway through their freshman year. So, it is weird, and I think it's a testament to how good he is, but it's also one of those weird deals in college football that if you have a player that's that good, they can carry you a long time. And let me give one parallel. I've often argued that the Clemson championships from 2016 through 2018 were on the back of one defensive line class or one group of defensive linemen, right? And I know you've heard this argument from me several times, that if you look at that Lawrence Wilkins line, they got about 5 guys in that rotation that were all first and second round draft picks. It was probably a generational set of defensive talent that all came in 1 or 2 years, and a lot of them returned as seniors in 2018. And when you have guys like that can come in and make impacts as freshmen, and they stay 3 or 4 years and play the whole time, you almost end up with an entire era of dominance as a football team, because you get, basically over the course of 3 or 4 years, you get the kind of production that most teams only get for a year or two out of a high-level player, because of the time it takes for them to develop and go to pro early. So I think Brock Bowers in that tight end room, I won't say it's quite as impactful as a D-line can be, like that Clemson group, but I think there's some similarities there offensively for Georgia, and the fact that for an entire era of Georgia football, that tight end group has basically solidified the entire offense.
All right, let's close out Georgia. When we do these kind of previews or summer discussions about a team, before we see them. We don't pick their ultimate season, what they're going to do at the end of the year, that sort of thing. But I do think it's interesting to just regular season over under 11 wins. Let's say 11 and a half wins regular season. Are you taking under or over?
Over. I think they're more likely to go 12-0 than 11-1.
Okay. I'm going to go under. So you're over. I'm going to go under. I think they're going to lose. I think they're going to lose a game in the regular season, which, by the way, if that's the case, it's literally better for Georgia if they lose to Ole Miss than if they lose to Alabama or LSU or Texas A&M in the SEC championship game. It sounds worse, but it's literally better. I'm going to go under by half a game.
Yeah, there's an irony here, which is that I'm not sure that a loss in the regular season actually matters for Georgia, because I think they almost have to win the SEC championship game. So if you lose in the regular season, win the SEC championship game, you're going to go to the playoff anyway. So I don't know that matters. And the point we often make statistically, right, is if you have a 90% chance to win every game during the season, you are very likely to lose one game. I said over, but the reality is you're always safer picking a team to lose. It's very, very hard to go undefeated. It takes a lot of injury luck. It takes a lot of luck in not having a bad game versus a team on a good game, not playing in a hurricane, not a million other things. And I think Georgia's been down this road enough, 2012, 2018, right, where they were right on the cusp of things to know there are a lot of factors outside your control. It has a lot to do with what other teams you play that peak at the right time. And so it takes a lot of luck to go undefeated, and it takes a lot of luck to win a championship, even for the best teams.
So as part of these kind of conversational discussions that we're moving to, one of the things that I want to do, Josh, and for y'all listening, I think you'll like this, is a call your shot section. And we can only do this in the summer. We can't do this as much during the year. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But I think this is interesting because we can follow it as we go. So we're going to have a series of questions where we talk about sort of our shot calls that we're making in the summer. And these aren't hot takes like we're being unserious. Like these are things that we legitimately are calling that maybe other people aren't. And the first one is, who's going to win 10 games this year that nobody is thinking will win 10 games? And Josh, I will go first. And I'm going to say, in spite of a really tough schedule, I think Texas A&M is going to win 10 games this year, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, it's funny because Texas A&M fans, we go back and forth being called complete Texas A&M homers who would defend their 4 losses against, the top 5 teams in the country a few years ago, to being Texas A&M haters because we're honest about what they did with the NIL, even though we said, you're not breaking the rules that nobody else is not breaking, just admit it. But anyway, last year they were 5-7, Josh. They were 5-7 with a very talented team who had, I think, 5 one-score losses. So you do the math on that. Very talented team, held back, like we've said, for years by an offensive system that doesn't take advantage of the college game or its personnel to do things from a talent standpoint to just out-talent your team, something that Ohio State teams are very good at. Jimbo Fisher's system is really challenging for the quarterback. It's really hard to get easy wins, get any kind of inertia with good momentum with easy yards, and they get mired in this poor production, and you wake up and it's the middle of the third quarter and they're in a tight game with App State, right? I think bringing in a new coordinator, assuming he gives the keys to Petrino and not kind of hand in the cookie jar like we saw at Michigan for a few years. I think if it's truly stepping back and just being a CEO head coach, I think that we will see a lot more success offensively on an already talented team, and turn a lot of those one-score wins into a 10-win season. Josh, before you get into yours, kind of give me your thought on whether or not my shot called now is crazy.
Well, a bit. This is where everybody that watches the video is going to call us Texas A&M homers. It's funny. Every other year, we're either homers or haters for Texas A&M, 100% with nothing in the middle. But I don't know. Going from 5-7 to 10 wins is a lot. I think there could be a considerably better team, but they still play a tough division, and they still have a tough schedule ahead of them. So one of the things that's probably going to crop up on my end in a minute is they've got a tough out of conference opponent. I think Texas A&M is probably going to be a considerably better team. They had the best recruiting class in history a couple years ago, and a lot of those guys were kind of the core of the defense. And the thing that a lot of people missed with Texas A&M last year, really they lost games in part because the defense couldn't hold up against the run. And they couldn't hold up against the run, in my opinion, because they were playing much older teams. And they needed time in the weight room. They needed time to mature. And they got play. If you rely on too many freshmen, even if they're super high star, 5-star freshmen, a 19-year-old 5-star is probably not going to be able to throw a 22-year-old fifth-year senior in another team out of the way. The App State game, they really outplayed App State statistically for most of the game, but App State got a few points on the board, and at the end of the game, App State was able to keep Texas A&M off the field, and Texas A&M just could not stop App State from getting 3 or 4 yards of play. So I think you're absolutely right. They're going to turn things around and be better. I think they're going to be a better football team. I think offensively they could make a big step forward, but I still think their offensive side of the football, I don't know that they have great quarterbacks. I don't know that they have a fantastic receiving core, which you need in the SEC to be a 10-win team. I think they've lost some of their superstar impact skill position talent. When you look at them last year, the ability to get explosive plays out of the running back position was a key to their success, and they lose that guy. So I think there's reasons to think they maybe are going to improve to an 8 or 9 win team and not a 10-win team. Is really all I'm getting at. Now let me get to my two, because one is a transition. One team that came up pretty early in my thought process for a team that's has the potential to improve. This is Texas A&M's out of conference opponent, Miami. Miami last year had a terrible season where they didn't meet any of their expectations, where Van Dyke was not anywhere near the quarterback people expected. And our old pal, Josh Gaddis, was the offensive coordinator that sort of orchestrated the collapse. Now, the two of us have been critical of him dating back to really his time at Michigan when he left Alabama. We noted the fact that it didn't make any sense for Michigan to take a guy that had really never called plays in his career to be the offensive coordinator. He failed spectacularly, I think, at Michigan. The rumors I heard at the end of his career is that he really wasn't allowed to run the offense anymore. Goes to Miami. They have a total offensive implosion. If you really buy the narrative that Josh Gaddis just really was that unprepared to be offensive coordinator, and you buy the fact that they probably had a bit of an implosion as a football team as a result of that last season, I could see Miami being a team that could turn things around substantially. Texas A&M in week 2 is going to be a very tough game. I think it is a winnable game for Miami. I don't know that I would pick them to win it. We'll see. They have to play at North Carolina, they have to play Clemson, and they have to play at Florida State. That's the biggest thing that gives me pause about calling them an actual 10-win team. But to me, they're in the same realm as Texas A&M as a team that I think people on a national level are sleeping on as somebody that could really be actually vying for a playoff position if some chips fall the right way. My team that I really think has a very good shot of hitting 10 wins is Oklahoma. Oklahoma, due to conference realignment, has, I think, an interesting schedule. It is a consistently difficult schedule, but I'm not sure that it's one that has a lot of world beaters on it. And what I mean by that is from the new teams, they pick up all of 10th Cincinnati, UCF, and BYU. I think all three of those teams are dangerous teams that could beat people. I think UCF is in for a rude awakening to realize what it's like to play an actual P5 schedule every single week. And I know TCU just won the Big 12, just made it to the playoffs. Different situation there because of how long they've been in the conference, how long it took them to get to that point. I know they were good in 2014. I just don't know that any of those teams this year specifically are going to be that good. Oklahoma patched a lot of holes in their football team through recruiting and through the transfer portal. I think they've had to undergo a culture change. Last year, their team suffered a lot because Gabriel got hurt. They're sitting at 9.5 wins, I think, over under. Maybe that's wrong. I need to look that up. But I think overall, when you look at them as a football team, one of their most losable games, maybe TCU coming back, though it's a very different roster from TCU, and they got to play Texas. And outside that, out of conference, Arkansas State, SMU, and Tulsa. So they get the other side of that Georgia scheduling deal where Georgia canceled with Oklahoma. Oklahoma also canceled on Georgia, and I think Oklahoma has a very, very good shot to win 10 games in 2023.
Oklahoma was my pick, Josh. Before I dug a little deeper, I didn't love some of Dylan Gabriel's performances outside of the injury, and I feel like games like UCF might be a little tougher than they look on paper. But that was my other potential pick. So interesting that we're kind of in alignment.
And I'll say I extra myself, but yeah, they are set at 9.5. And my point there is I think it's very reasonable for them to drop 2 games, but dropping 3, I mean, they can lose to Texas and UCF and go 10-2, right?
Right.
They basically are going to have to lose to Texas, lose to UCF, and lose again to somebody like TCU. 10 wins is really viable for Oklahoma this year, and I almost think 9.5 wins is conservative.
So next question up is so we're kind of giving Caleb Williams sort of the best numbers. We're gonna assume that he's gonna have the best passing numbers, the best statistics from a quarterback this year. Who's number 2? And right now, I think a lot of people think Joe Milton might be that guy because Heupel's system's going to put up numbers. Some other potential candidates, Josh: Jordan Travis, Bo Nix, KJ Jefferson, or some that were on my radar. I'm going Bo Nix, and the other obvious answer could be whomever plays quarterback wins the job at Ohio State, because Ohio State, I think this year, doesn't have a Power 5 out-of-conference opponent. They've got a pretty easy schedule, especially in terms of teams, past defensive teams statistically from last year. But I think KJ Jefferson's going to be pretty good. They've got some offensive line concerns there. I think they lost 3 stars in the offensive line. People don't realize how good he is. When he went down last year, that offense went to nothing, and he put up pretty good numbers last year, 8.8 yards per attempt, had a good touchdown-interception ratio, can run as well. I think the schedule might keep him from putting up pure, raw numbers. Similarly, I think Jordan Travis is an excellent potential dark horse Heisman candidate, or maybe kind of front-running Heisman candidate. Florida State's got a sneaky tough schedule this year. I think they're going to be a better team with a potentially worse record. I'm going Bo Nix, who has been that Heisman candidate, preseason Heisman candidate, since his freshman year. That's the joke that goes around on Twitter. Give me Bo Nix for number 2 in terms of Power 5 quarterback, pure statistical performance, right behind Caleb Williams. React, and then give me yours.
Yeah, and I'll defend Ohio State's honor a little bit. They play at Notre Dame this year, so they don't have.
I was wrong. I think it's next year.
Technically, Notre Dame isn't a P5 team. I guess they're an independent. They do play an FCS, but we won't belabor that particular point. Yeah, my answer to this is probably McCord. Whoever plays quarterback at Ohio State, their receiving core and offense is so much better positioned, I think, than virtually anyone else in college football. Or probably anyone else in college football, that you just figure they're going to have bonker numbers. There are a few other teams that are poised to be really successful. My personal apprehensions about yours, but offensively they're set up to be very successful this year at Texas, which I think is maybe appreciated, maybe not.
And Josh, I looked at those numbers too for Texas, just real quick. Outside of Alabama, they didn't play top 40 pass. They don't play a defense this year that was in the top 40 last year. They play a number of them that are from 80 to 100. So that is another good one.
Right. Yeah. And this is something that I think people haven't fully appreciated, is the fact that those AAC teams did roll into the Big 12. And I know people have high opinions of UCF and Cincinnati and BYU and Houston. But outside Cincinnati, those other 3 teams have not had good defenses. They have not had P5 caliber defenses, and that is probably going to even further inflate numbers, I think, in the Big 12. Another guy that I think really fell off the radar due to a slow end of last year is Drake May. I think he's one of the best, if not the best, pure quarterback in college football. His numbers easily could go up. He was a 10-plus yard per attempt passer halfway through the season, and then just really had a really rough end of the year, ending in those Clemson and Oregon games, but he wasn't really getting any help either. But yeah, I'm sticking with the fact that the best quarterbacks are going to be the guys that have the best surrounding cast, and it's probably going to be people that you're not necessarily thinking of. If I had to bet, um, I don't know that I would pick any of the established people. I don't know that I think it's going to be Bo Nix or anyone like that. I think most of them are going to have similar numbers than they did last year.
All right, so you got to call a shot. Give me number 2. Is it going to be McCord or whoever wins the starting job at Ohio State?
Yeah, I mean that's my answer. I think whoever wins the starting job at Ohio State is going to be
So I was
your stat later. Yeah,
I was a year early on Ohio State. This is how nerdy I am about some of this stuff. I'm familiar with Ohio State's 2024 schedule off the just offhand. They play Southern Miss, Western Michigan, and Marshall out of conference in 2024. I guess marking the arrival of UCLA and a tougher schedule. The whole playing 10 P5s every year is not as important to them. So anyway, okay, so that's those. It kind of bleeds into giving me 2 players for Heisman that aren't Caleb Williams. So if we're filling out the let's say there's 3 players in New York at the end of the year this year, give me 2 of them. I think we've pretty much established that it is a quarterback award. I don't know why I'm on this train, Josh, but I am on the Bo Nix train. I think Bo Nix is going to be in New York this year. And I think that you're right. The whoever starts for Ohio State is going to put up Heisman numbers. So give me QB1 for Ohio State, which is probably McCord, and Bo Nix to join Caleb Williams in New York for the Heisman celebration.
This is difficult because my actual answer here is I think this is a year where you need to pick the field. When you look at Heisman odds, and I'm looking at the top players right now, your top 5 are Caleb Williams, Quinn Ewers, Jaden Daniels, J.J. McCarthy, and Jordan Travis. I would be surprised if any more than 2 of those guys actually ends up in New York. And that's including the fact that I think Caleb Williams is almost a shoe-in. Personally, I might be higher on Penix Jr. than I am on Bo Nix, personally. I know both of us have issues with both of those quarterbacks because they've been consistently inconsistent in their careers. It is kind of a trademark of both of them that everybody always ends up high on them at a certain one point or another because of recent performances, and then invariably those bad games that both of them tend to have crop back up again and they repeat themselves. I don't personally expect that to go away. So as a result of that, I think the quarterback from Ohio State is probably going to end up there in New York. I just think their surrounding talent is so good that it's such a position for them to succeed, and it's going to take a really kind of shockingly poor quarterback performance for that not to happen, and it probably would be the storyline of the season if the quarterback is not in New York. But on top of that, I will say I think we're going to have 1 or 2 running backs emerge. I really do think the field this year is the pick. I think you're going to see 1 or 2 quarterbacks that no one has on the radar whatsoever that blow up. Probably going to be new starters at different schools. We've talked about a lot, right? That if you look at the last 15 years of college football, if you could pick the field as a betting odd, you're more likely than not going to win by doing that because most of your the big-time quarterback blow-up guys have been Cam Newton, Johnny Manziel, Mac Jones, Devontae Smith. Guys that weren't even remotely on the radar end up being the favorites and hot guys at the end of the year, the best quarterbacks, the best wide receivers, etc. Are very often new starters. I know Mac Jones didn't win the Heisman, but point being, he was the highest rated quarterback probably by the end of the year. And I don't think how many people really had him even on the radar, even having seen him play a few games. And I think there are probably going to be some running backs that emerge. It seems like college football is shifting a little bit back away from being a pure pass-happy RPO scheme and being a little more power-centric. And there are enough teams with enough high-level running back play that I think you're going to see somebody emerge from one of these schools to be sort of a powerhouse guy for their school, for their conference, and end up being in New York. So not a real specific answer. I know you want specific names. Outside McCord, I don't know that I can give you one. But it comes down to the fact that I think more than ever, I think this year overall, not just talking the Heisman race, but overall is probably going to have a lot of storylines dominated by guys that are not currently in the discussion, but will be the focus of the discussion come October.
One, and we'll do a Bama preview in the next video, but whomever wins the starting job in Tuscaloosa, I think there is a very high potential that they're going to come out of nowhere and put up monster numbers, because I maintain, and I think you do too a little bit, that Bill O'Brien's scheme was fit for the NFL, and he held that offensive scheme and that the pure numbers back a good bit last year. And we've got someone coming in that I say we. Everybody's gonna be like, oh, it's an Alabama fan. We, in thinking in this discussion, Alabama's got somebody coming in that's going to really push for easy yards, scheme yards, and get a lot of points there. So I think there's an opportunity there for Alabama quarterback and maybe a Georgia running back. But a lot of the good running back rooms are by committee, which makes it tough to win a Heisman. All right, Josh, next one up, a team who won't win 10 games that is currently projected to win 10 games. Mine is Tennessee. I think that if you look at the margin for error on Tennessee is very slim to win 10 games, given that their out-of-conference game against Virginia is not a big one. You know, I think Virginia lost 7-8 games last year. But they've got Alabama, who they barely beat at home last year, and they could beat them again. I don't think that's going to be a runaway in either direction, but that's going to be clearly a tough game to win. And they've got Georgia, who they haven't been able to beat. So if they lose those two games, they have absolutely zero margin for error. They've got Texas A&M is one of their draws from the West, which is not an easy draw. I mean, people are going to look at it and say they went 5-7 last year. They're one of our teams that we both think Texas A&M is going to really improve. I could see Tennessee going 9-3 or 8-4 this year, and I wouldn't be shocked at all. React and give me yours.
Well, they would have been my first pick, and in fact, the Solid Verbal had tweeted out about it, and they asked who we thought we would be most sure about picking the under, and Tennessee was my answer. I was the one that replied on that, and it's simply because, one, I don't trust Milton. If you go back and even watch the Clemson game where he put up big numbers, he missed as many throws as he hit, and through his career, he's been very inaccurate downfield. Yes, he has a huge cannon of an arm, but he is a very inconsistent passer. And in that offense with Tennessee, where they take so many deep shots, those deep shots can be big plays, and they can just as easily be incompletions that turn into punts. And in games like South Carolina, where they were off for a quarter or two, they can dig a big hole really fast in that scheme with as many shots as they take. Because those shots don't get you any yards. And now you've got to get 6 yards to play on second down and third down. And so when they're cold and at the tempo they run, they give a lot of possessions to the other team. I think there's a lot of potential for them to drop some games they really shouldn't drop if they have inconsistent quarterback play. And Milton is an extremely inconsistent quarterback. So they're, yeah. And combine that again with a team that was one of the worst pass defenses in the country last year. So that really amps up the potential for Tennessee to dig themselves a hole in a team that gets hot passing the ball. Almost anybody could throw the football on Tennessee last season. I expect it'll probably be the case again. That's a recipe for a team that I think is probably slated to miss projections. My alternate pick, since you took them, though, I'm going to say LSU. Picking again in the SEC. I think the SEC is going to be a meat grinder. And when we talk about, for example, Texas A&M being a team that could be a lot better than expected, every team that does better than expected and wins more games than expected means somebody else in the conference loses games they weren't expected to lose, right? It's a zero-sum game. We always talk about every conference goes 500 against itself. And in the same vein, every team can't improve within the same conference, at least from a win-loss perspective. Every team that does better, every team that exceeds expectations, that means somebody else loses more games. And I think LSU may get caught in that. And when you look at them last year, they lost to a good, not necessarily great Florida State team. They lost to Tennessee, which no shame in that, except they lost 40-13. They lost to a bad Texas A&M team by multiple scores. And then they got blown out by Georgia. The whole season, I think, really hinged around that overtime win over Alabama. And I'll be blunt, kind of tipping my hat a little bit to the Alabama preview. I don't think Alabama was necessarily a great football team last year, and Alabama fans have refused to accept that fact. But they were a merely good to great team. They were not an elite team. They didn't play at that level. Sure, in the Kansas State game and the bowl game, they look like an elite team. That team had not stepped foot on the field all season. And they went, I think, an entire quarter in the LSU game going 3-and-out. If you accept that Alabama really wasn't that good, that they really were that team that almost lost to Ole Miss too, that almost lost to Texas A&M, just one pass away from losing to a bad A&M team themselves, suddenly that LSU season was kind of a 9-3 season by default. And for them to be in a 9.5 over under, and a lot of people to have them a 10-win team when they didn't win 10 last year, where I think Alabama's going to be a good bit better than they were last season. I don't know. I think it's asking a lot. The schedule is a little more favorable, right? They draw Missouri from the East. They don't have to play Tennessee. So I think the schedule helps them out a lot. But a lot of retooling on the defensive side of the ball. It was an offense last year that was not very consistent, and at times wasn't even that good. And I think there are a lot of assumptions being made about how good Jaden Daniels is going to be in year two, when a lot of people would say the only reason they even made a game against Georgia was that Jaden Daniels hit the bench and the backup came and played a lot better. So LSU is my pick for a team that I think is likely to miss expectations and likely to fail to win 10 games, even though a lot in the media have them that high.
All right, playoff field. We're going to pick the playoff field now. Calling our shot. And Josh, no cheating. You can't say the winner of this conference or whatever. You have to pick 4 teams. I am going with, and this is, I said year 3 for Sark was the year to win the Big 12 championship. I'm going Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and Ohio State. And we've missed the Ohio State-Michigan preview pick 2 years in a row. I looked at it a little bit, and, Ohio State, I maintain that Ohio State had a big advantage in that they started prepping early in 2020 for Clemson, and that's why they looked so bad against Northwestern in the championship game. They were obsessed with revenge from 2019, and they took it out on them and then looked kind of unprepared for Alabama, or just at least overwhelmed. Same thing last year. I think that they sat out the conference championship game and they over-prepared for Georgia in a way that Georgia couldn't quite do because they had LSU, obviously. And I think that it showed on the field. I think if they played 10 times, the game wouldn't be that as close as it was. To your point, I don't think Ohio State was quite as good as they showed in that game last year. But last year, if you remember, Michigan needed a lot of lucky breaks at the very end of that game to beat Illinois the week before they played Ohio State. And I think a lot of it has to do with, in my mind, I could be wrong, I think Michigan used that as a prep week for Ohio State. And Ohio State was playing Maryland, a team that held their own against Michigan. I think Michigan beat them by 1 touchdown. So Ohio State didn't have that luxury. I think this year it's a little different. I think Michigan's got Maryland before Ohio State. Ohio State's got Minnesota. So I think Ohio State is going to win the Big Ten this year, make the playoffs. I think Georgia has the opportunity to maybe drop a game and still make it in. I think Alabama's schedule is so tough that they could lose the SEC championship game and still make it in. And I think Texas wins the Big 12 and makes it in. USC is that dark horse because they might be that much better than everybody else in the Pac-12, but their schedule is not easy, and I think it's going to cause them to trip up. Give me your 4, and we'll wrap this sucker up.
Yeah, my 4 are going to be USC. I do think that they are that much better than everyone in the Pac-12, and I think that gets them in. You end up with a Pac-12 team in the playoff again. And again, the only reason the Pac-12 hasn't made it is because they've cannibalized themselves more than anything. Champions losing out of conference early in the season hasn't helped them. And to that vein, I think that keeps Texas out. I think Texas is going to lose to Alabama, and I think that's going to make it very hard for Texas to be able to make the playoff, even if they do win the conference. I don't think they can drop another game in the regular season, and that's a tall ask. And I don't have enough confidence in Oklahoma running the slate themselves So I don't think the Big 12 makes it. I think Ohio State makes it from the Big 10. Like, to your point, let me flip it around. It's kind of unfair that we're both picking Ohio State again, even though Michigan's beat them 2 years in a row. But, man, the more I go back and look at last season, the more I look at those picks, I know we were wrong to pick Ohio State based on the result on the field, but I still don't walk away from that really feeling like 100% that Michigan was the better football team. And the playoff, I think it was a bit of a fluke how poorly Michigan played in the playoff. And at some point, you have to accept the fact that Michigan has consistently performed poorly in postseason play in recent years under Harbaugh. There's something to that. But I also think Ohio State just wasn't a consistent football team and kind of laid an egg in that game against Michigan, got hit in the mouth and didn't know how to respond. And there were some things that went against them in that game. So I'm going to stick with Ohio State. I'm going to pick Alabama. I think Alabama is more likely than Georgia to come out of the SEC. They do have a tougher schedule, but this goes to a point where we're making the Georgia preview. For the SEC teams, I don't know that dropping a game in the regular season really matters. I just don't know that it does. What really matters is whether you win the conference. And if you go undefeated, if you're Alabama and you go undefeated in the regular season, I think you can lose to Georgia and very easily make the playoff because the schedule is going to be substantially more difficult. Again, Texas may win the Big 12 and Alabama have beaten them, and they could drop another SEC game. And are you going to put Texas in over a team that beat them and had a harder schedule? I don't know if you would. So they have a lot of leeway. For the sake of argument, this is where I'm actually going to leave Georgia out. I'm going to put another team in that I think is being slept on due to a 1-year slip-up, really, and that is Clemson. Clemson makes a change at offensive coordinator. I think things have gotten stale the last 2 years offensively. I think people are really sleeping on how much more talented they are than the rest of their conference. A guy that I almost picked for our discussion of our Heisman candidates with Klubnik, just because I think the surrounding talent he has is so good. The surrounding defensive talent at Clemson is so far beyond everything else in the ACC. I think Clemson is a team that I don't know that I would pick them to win the championship, and I'm not sure how close I am to even thinking about picking them to win the national title. But given their schedule, they play Notre Dame, they play North Carolina, they play Florida State, all at home. There are only 3 preseason ranked teams, or at least currently ranked teams on their schedule. Clemson, I think, has everything lined up. Soft S, not a Z. It's hard for me. I don't know why. But they have everything lined up to make the playoff.
Yeah, I think that's a good pick, especially since I don't think people realize Clemson had an experiment at offensive coordinator, and it kind of like Ryan Day taking a little too long to make a change at defensive coordinator, which cost him in 2020. I think that Clemson, with the right offensive coordinator last year, would have been a really tough out against the best team. So that's a good pick. I think that their schedule is pretty tough, and I think Florida State is good enough that they might give them a run, and I think that the ACC in some ways is a little better than it's been in the past. But it's a great pick. All right, y'all, that's it for us. This has been a long kind of one take for us, and it's been a lot of fun, but give us your feedback. Would you prefer the older kind of way we did it with a little more regimented approach, having specific talking points, or this kind of free-form discussion where we just kind of talk ball and have a loose skeleton of things that we want to talk about? Don't forget, website's up, collegefootballnerds.com. You can find us on the podcast. You can find us on YouTube, especially with the way we're doing these. It might be better to you might prefer to listen to it that way. Sign up for that newsletter. Monday and Thursday newsletter comes out, and we'll have a lot more interesting stuff to talk about in that newsletter as we get into the college football season. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.